So if the brand kit is good, if you build a good brand kit, you should be able to hand this over to either a junior designer or sort of, if you're a founder with design skills, you'll be able to take it and implement it so that it looks more professional, it looks more legit. Because let's be real, the goal for startups is to look legit. I think this is a big challenge. When you're just starting out, if you can look 10 times bigger than you actually are.
I see. Thank you. Okay. For example, so thanks to your first customer. Oh, I love your product, your service. I'm gonna introduce other friends, and then you guys getting more and more customers, right? This is amazing. And so, what kind of requirement they have? For example, some founder, we have a kind of a product, but we don't have website. Please make website. Or some company requires you, hey, please make only logo. Or depends on company or depends on founder's mindset. Like requirement, like is different, right?
Yeah, this is a good question because you need to consider the requirements of the founder and what you want to offer. They have a lot of requirements. I mean, it's normal. They want many things, and they founders, they need so many things when they want it yesterday, right? And so they have these requirements, and they are the product that we offer. So at the beginning, we're just doing whatever they would ask. So branding and product, these two, I would say, pillars. So on the branding side, you have the brand system. And we would also even make some help with social media, like really communication assets. And on the product side, interfaces. So whether it's an app or software, we would make the interfaces, and also the marketing websites are sort of an overlap on product and brand, but any startups, they need a landing page. So this is how at the beginning we're just doing whatever they needed, and usually they need the same thing. They need something to be able to build and something to be able to launch. So they need a product that works, that is a delight to use, and they need a brand. This is the things that they were asking. And then you also need to, as a business, we needed to niche down. You cannot do everything, otherwise you're not profitable. So today we do 3 things. We do websites, brand system, and product sprint. Product sprint.
Oh, sprint.
Yeah. So all of these 3 products we call them product services. It's only 4 weeks. Almost same. It's the same process. And if you want more, we'll also provide. It's not unlimited, but it's monthly design support. This is good for startups that don't have a design team and they just outsource everything. So it's basically fractional design.
You can offer a brand system, website.
Yeah. Brand identity.
Brand identity.
Website. And product. So the fundamental design assets that all startups need in order to launch and get traction. Brand identity. So, just to put it into more plain English. So it's a brand kit that include logo, colors, what we call the graphical elements, or everything that makes your brand recognizable. For example, at Adidas, the logo, you have the logo, and then you have the bars. This is a recognizable sign, graphic, for example. So these kind of all these assets need to be thought as a full system. And we also include some guidelines, which we call brand guidelines, that give some indication to use these assets. And the goal is that they have this foundation that they can use to build their product and website. So if the brand kit is good, if you build a good brand kit, you should be able to hand this over to either a junior designer or sort of, if you're a founder with design skills, you'll be able to take it and implement it. so that it looks more professional, it looks more legit. Because let's be real, the goal for startups is to look legit. I think this is a big challenge. When you're just starting out, if you can look 10 times bigger than you actually are, you have a head start.
I see. Brand kit,
Yeah.
including color and like logo and other asset. So how do you define these kit? For example, you can interview founders. Hey, what color do you like that? Or you can observe their, I don't know, like company's service or background, and then you can make imagination.
I think there are many ways to make a brand kit. For us, our stance is that we need to be super strategic because it's their baby. It's their, it has to reflect their vision. But we also need to be super hands-on quickly because it cannot take 3 months. I've worked for bigger companies before, so I know that on average it can take 3 months, 6 months. For us, it has to be less than 4 weeks or 6 weeks. So the idea is that we don't spend too much time looking at the competition or looking at what the audience wants because it's a new product. So I think just bringing something, it doesn't really make sense to compare too much to the other alternatives. So we really sit with the founders or the founding team and try to sort of distill the traits that make them unique, the culture, the vision, of course, what their personal tastes, if they have some requirements. Also, the strategy behind the company, if they really want to disrupt a category, or on the contrary, do they need to blend in because they play in a super corporate, conservative market that will not accept a disruptor or challenger? Or do they want to be the super challengers? These are different brand positioning and brand angle. So we unpack all this. This take a few hours of workshop. And then we will translate this into a brand strategy and a visual direction that we will present to them. And then once we've agreed on a direction, so this is the type of message, the type of personality, the type of visual universe that we want to build, then we just roll out everything. So we design and then we implement usually we implement a sort of really tangible assets at the end of the project. So they live with the brand kit, but most of the time they also live with a minimal landing page or something like that.
Yeah, minimum landing page. This is so important. And then, so if I am your client, I like your website. Thank you so much. And then, so we are launching new function. So could you please make like about us page, like about product page, and then like extra subscription next month, like that.
Yeah, this is why we realized you cannot. Usually, when you build a website, there will be some follow up. So we have what we call the 90-day care package, where they can basically they can ask all the questions and they can ask they can do any edits that they want. So this is quite important, I think. Otherwise, we can just do another sprint. That's okay.
I see.
We try not to work for free too much, obviously, but I understand that it's once your website is live, you still have some edits to make, and this is a really difficult thing with startups, is that they need something that looks professional. I really believe that this is a game changer, but at the same time, it has to be editable and scalable because things will change, and things change every other week. So if we make, for example, the landing, the framer site should be also well structured, and it should be scalable in the sense that we should think ahead of time about this, which part should be editable, but which part should be CMS and which part should not. And yeah, that's also why our projects are short and we think affordable, so that if there is a change to make, of course, people will not work with us every other week, but they can just make another sprint. That's why it's called sprint, because any change, okay, we can do 2 weeks more, 4 weeks more.
I see. Thank you so much. So, Carl, I have tons of questions, Apolline. So, for instance, some standard, like, for example, fintech company in US, they have a similar website, right? We don't need to create super unique original website. We can research their industry standard, and then we can get insights, and then we can make kind of similar but kind of original style of website, right?
Yeah.
So do you do such a competitor audit? And also, if possible, we want to do user interview, right? But this is maybe kind of extra, not in the first package. What is?
Yeah, you know what? We used to have a product called Discovery, where we would do research, and the reason is that we have the resources. We're actually really good at research, but no one ever asked us to do research. I mean, paid us to do it. I think most founders like to do it themselves, or may I say, think that they can do it themselves. I mean, anyone can ask questions, right? Anyone can just find users and to ask questions. I do believe that it's something that requires some skills. I mean, you're a designer, so you know it. And there are a couple of things that you need to be experienced in that field. So I believe if you can, it's good to ask professionals to do it. Yeah. So that's why we have this package. But I have to say, most founders, I think they bootstrap startups. At least they like to do it themselves, and they would outsource the services that they cannot do. They would look for a design partner like us to do really the heavy lifting in all the things that you really need, like a stunning output visually. This is my observation.
I see. Thank you. Okay. And also, maybe kind of a big gap between designer side and also founder side is, so I saw many founders, they come from engineering side.
Yeah.
That's why, right? So that they said, we can make website, we can make product. We don't need to hire designer. This is kind of many founders' mindset. Yeah. But because of if they have a budget, maybe they want to hire kind of a chicken or egg, right? So I believe you guys have such a similar experience. So how did you convince or talk with such a mindset founders?
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I think that it's a chicken and egg problem, and we think a lot about this. Of course, we cannot convince people to invest in design if they don't believe in it. We're not here for that. So we don't work with startups if they don't want design help. But there is something I really wish founders knew, is that most founders believe that they can't get world-class design just because they're small. Yeah. That they have to wait for the time they will be big, they will have more funds. But I don't think it's true anymore. I think with the tool that we have, AI, I think we have methods to productivize, our services and to make them much cheaper and efficient. I mean, our services are like 10 or 20 times cheaper than what you get in my previous agency or traditional agencies, and the quality is not lower. It's just that it's adjusted. It's designed for startups, so it's much shorter, much more efficient. So I think it's normal that some founders think, yeah, we don't really need, we need design, of course, but we can't afford it. But they need to think that the number one reason why startups fail is the lack of traction.
Lack of traction.
Lack of traction. So they don't resonate. They have a product, but it doesn't strike a chord with anyone. I think that's the number one reason for failure. But if you think about it, the companies that are really good at raising funds and doing sales and attracting the best team, these are the ones usually that are really good at telling their story. And also really good at creating products that are a joy to use. So it does make an enormous difference. And the good news is that it's possible. I think it's possible for bootstrap companies, and most of our clients are actually bootstrap companies. You think, everyone is funded, but that's not true.
Really?
Yeah.
Interesting. Okay, so if possible, could you please share about this story, the startup who did bootstrap and then kind of succeeded?
So I'm going to take, for example, this company called Cubic. It's a software for interior designers and architects focused on lighting. So you see lighting like this. So if you're an architect, you have a bunch of software for CAD or to make architecture, but you don't have anything to help you design the lighting plan. And lighting plan is not something that's really incorporated into the skill set of architects usually. It's like it's on the side, but they need to master it. So this software enables them to automate this process, to just make them much better at lighting with the power of automation, AI, etc. And this company, we've been building their product for a couple of years now with them. They actually don't have anyone in-house. They don't have a designer. They don't have a CMO. They do have some engineers. But we do all the design part and for them. And of course, these companies, they have a side business usually that enable them to fund themselves. So I'm also thinking about Aokumo AI, since this is an AI podcast. So Aokumo AI, they have a side consulting business that fund the product. And this is how I think a lot of our clients manage to work with like professionals like us that help them do the heavy lifting. Like they have this mindset of, okay, we are bootstrap companies, but we have a little bit of money that comes from another source of money, of revenues. We have a side business, and we want to work with the best at the early stages, because actually at the early stages you cannot hire designers, right? You cannot hire senior designers or good designers. It's going to be way too expensive for you. So why don't we just hire professionals just to do the most important things. In the case of Cubic, they can afford to have us on a regular basis. For Aokumo, for example, they hire us for product and website. But the products and website as well, they change all the time. So we do sprint once in a while to update. But at the end, this is more cost effective because you don't need to hire someone. And also, over time, it helps you to move faster because you have assets that make you more attractive and gain traction. I think the Cubic side at the beginning had like 25% conversion. It was crazy. It was probably the best designed website in the construction industry because the standards are so low. But I think it can really make a difference. And I would say when you have, you bigger, you can hire a design team. So you don't necessarily need a design partner like us. And I don't believe startups should work with us forever. I think the early stages are super critical. Like you should outsource the most important thing and not lose too much time with a junior designer or a random freelance that you can find on Fiverr that you might actually it might make you lose a lot of time because you need to coach them and you can't judge the quality of the work. But once you have a system in place, and you have, for example, if you have a really good brand system, or you have a really good design system for your product, even a junior designer can probably execute it. The person that you're going to hire later.
Because of we already have a brand system, and
Yeah.
I see.
But you need the foundation. A junior person cannot build the foundation. That's the thing. Well, he's going to spend so much time and make so many mistakes. So I would take the shortcut at the beginning, and then hire someone just to do the operational, to expand the system and to execute it.
I see. And what I learned from this conversation is big things for me. Is so as an entrepreneur, even creative agencies owner, we had better to have side business so that we don't need to worry about new project or asking someone and pay. Because of thanks to side business, we have income, and then we can use this budget to what can I say, maintain our new startup. This
I
is
think as a founder, you don't have so much choice, right? Either you have a day job, so you're working in your previous company, and you're just waiting for your startup to take off. Either you just leave and you fund it, and you're really good at fundraising, or you have a side business. But usually the people they have a side business because it was their initial business. It usually is a service business, like a consulting business, that they turn into a product. So they just bring all their expertise. So in the case of Chubik, they are lighting designers. So they've been lighting designers. They've been doing lighting design for 20 years, and they're like, let's make a product out of it because it's so much more scalable. For Akumo, it's the same. So Akumo AI is a co-pilot, AI co-pilot. They've been doing AI consulting for years, and now they can do it. I think you could have also recruiters, headhunters who've been headhunting. Now they want to build a tool, and you could easily keep your revenues from headhunting in order to build a tool.
I see.
So you don't need to. Ideally, you don't want to raise funds too early, right? Depends on your business model, but for some type of business, you can do it. Not for apps, consumer apps. Don't do it.
The 3 key takeaways from conversation with Apolline Part 2. 1. Founders need both branding and product launch successfully. Early stage founders often need both functional product and a strong brand, but they don't always realize it. Example, many startup founders initially ask for a logo or landing page, but they actually need a full brand system, logo, colors, design assets, and guidelines to look professional and gain traction. The key is to look 10 times bigger than you actually are, so investors and customers take you seriously. 2. How designers can work effectively and with early-stage founders. Founders often don't understand the full value of design, so designers needed to educate them while working efficiently. Tips 1. Move fast and stay flexible. Startup change quickly, so designers should deliver within 4 to 6 weeks instead of taking a month. Tips 2. Focus on strategy, not just aesthetic. Founders need brand system, not just a pretty logo, scalable design asset. Tip 3. Don't wait for perfect research. Early stage startups don't have tons of user data yet. Instead, designers should extract insights from their founder's vision and goals to create strong A brand. 3. Side business can help bootstrap startup without raising funds. Many founders keep a side business to sustain their startup instead of raising money too early. Example, the company Chubik a software for lighting designers, started as a consulting business, making money first before turning their expertise into a scalable product. Lesson: founders can sell service first. They build a product. They don't depend on external funding and maintain control on their business. Okay, thank you so much for watching our episode today. We hope our conversation will help your future and career. If you like this episode, please give you a like and subscribe us. So next episode is the conversation with Apolline Part 3. Please stay tuned. バイバイ。またね。チャオ。